how you like it, yeah.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the We Don't Know TV podcast. My name is Leaf. I am your host. This is a podcast where we watch the first episode of a show and then we talk about it. Today, we are talking about House of the Dragon. So, I was one of those people who, at the end of the last season of Game of Thrones, I was like, I'm done with this show. I don't want any more. They were announcing at the time, like, 3 different spin-off shows, and I remember being like, nah, I don't want any part of it. And so, when they finally decided to do House of the Dragon, I was like, I'm still out. I'll wait to see what everyone else says. And I think a couple episodes in, everyone was like, no, this is actually good. Like, give it a chance. I remember watching it and being like, all right, okay, cool. This is actually, like, good. You know, and I kept up with it. I'm currently watching season 2. As I was recording this, it's still going on now. So, yeah, this one was a little weird to go back to just from, like, the history of it all. But the premise on IMDb states an internal succession war within the House Targaryen at the height of its power, 172 years before the birth of Daenerys Targaryen. I can't read. So yeah, this is a good 172 years before Game of Thrones. Plenty of time to kind of work with, and I think that's pretty concise. And especially with Game of Thrones, you never know like how crazy things can get. Speaking of how crazy things would get, I totally forgot before I started watching this show that I have to take notes on all of this. So as the show is going on, I'm like progressively taking notes. I'm like, all right, make sure I got people's names and I know what's going on. There's so much. I had to watch it with subtitles going on. But if it's your first time here, I go through the plot beat by beat. That way you don't have to, and that way I don't forget anything. So we actually start off with the classic voiceover. If this is your first time on the podcast, a lot of the shows I watch end up having a voiceover to explain what's going on. So it seems to be a trend. I don't know when it started, probably like 2010. But so we got a voiceover of a woman, and she's saying, as the first century of the Targaryen dynasty came to a closure, the health of the old king Jaehaerys was failing. The Targaryens were at the height of their strength. They had 10 dragons under their command. Jaehaerys reigned for over 60 years of peace, but both of his sons had died, and in the year 101, he called a great council. Over 1,000 lords showed up, and 14 people laid claims for the throne. Only 2 people were ended up being chosen towards the end, which is Princess Rhaenys and Prince Viserys. And of course, Viserys ended up getting it because he's a man, because at this time, you know, they're not really picking women for leadership. And it turns out that Daenerys is the narrator's father, and that Jaehaerys did this to stop a war, because only the House of the Dragon could end up destroying itself. So he just wanted to stop that from happening altogether. We get the intro, which ends up just not being the Game of Thrones like song that we're used to. It is just like the Targaryen symbol of like the 3 dragons, or like the dragon with the 3 heads. And then we're just into the episode. We got a little text that says Viserys has been ruling for 9 years. Again, it is 172 years before the death of the Mad King and the birth of Daenerys. We start off in the clouds. Someone is riding a dragon. We don't see who. We see this beautiful sweeping shot of like the city, and it still holds up now. I mean, granted, it's only been a couple years, or like a year. But you never know it's CG, you know what I mean? But it still looks good. We find out that the dragon is called Syrax. It lands down. Turns out the Wranglers have to like calm it down. Dragons aren't like dogs. They don't just like, chill out. They're a lot more wild than that. And you can see that one of the Wranglers is like scared out of his mind. And like the main one's like, yo, dude, you gotta calm down. Like, don't let it show. Like, don't show fear or else bad things are gonna happen. We meet the princess, who is the one riding the dragon. The guard in the back is like, I'm glad you came back alive. Because anytime you go out with the dragon, you never know. Princess goes over and she talks to her friend. She's like, the dragon's getting big enough for maybe the 2 of us to ride. And her friend's like, nah, I'm just going to stay here on the ground. It's not my thing. And the Wranglers end up leading Syrax into a cave. This is kind of where we start. We head into the city. Right off the bat, so far, there's no names. Even in the subtitles, it's not telling you like who's talking. People are just living their lives. So it is very unclear, like, who is who yet. And that's also an issue I kind of had getting later into the show, but we'll get to that part. So far, the princess and her friend are walking around, and they're holding hands. And maybe it's because they're both, like, teenage girls. But I was like, are we supposed to take that as them just being friends, just holding hands, like, walking around? Or, like, are they a little more? Is it not weird simply because they're girls? Like, I don't know. But we end up meeting the queen. She is pregnant. She says Rhaenyra's name, who is the princess for the first time. So we meet Rhaenyra. She's like, I don't like you flying around that dragon while I'm pregnant. And she's like, Mom, you never like me flying around the dragon in general. And we find out that Rhaenyra's friend is named Alicent. Rhaenyra is worried about her mother. She's like, we have all these servants, but they're only really worried about you, the baby. They're not really paying attention to what you need. And she's like, soon you'll have to lie here and you'll have to pop out a baby. And, this is our job because we're royalty. This discomfort is how we serve the realm. And Rhaenyra is not about it. She's already one of those characters. And we see this a lot recently of characters from, like, I don't know if feudal is the right word, but like olden times, right? Who are like, I don't want to be just a queen or whatever. I want to go out and like, be with the boys or like, do my own thing. And Rhaenyra is no different. She's like, I'd rather be a knight, honestly, and ride into battle. Her mom's like, listen, we have royal wombs. Our battlefield is giving birth. And she's like, go take a bath. You smell like a dragon. We cut to Viserys, Viserys, who is the king. He's in a meeting with his council. Corlys brings up that there is this thing called the Triarchy. There's these free cities, and they've kind of like come together, and they're like kind of making like their own army. They're getting rid of pirates in this area called the Stepstones. And everyone's like, sounds like good news to us. Like, why do we need more pirates? And he's like, no, you're not listening. There's a guy called Kragus Jahar, and he's their leader, and they're calling him the crab feeder because of like how violent he is. And they're like, okay, like, are we supposed to cry over dead pirates? Like, I don't. And he's like, well, no, but. And this is where Rhaenyra comes in. Apparently, she's late. She's the cupbearer. She goes around pouring wine for everybody. So as she comes in, Corlys sits down. You can see he's clearly disappointed. It's one of those things of like, hey, this could be a problem, and no one seems to actually care because it's not a problem right now. And it's like, all right, well, that's clearly setting up an issue that's going to happen later. Also, Corlys is one of the only black characters, especially in this council. So it's nice to see representation, and then also it's kind of, I don't know if they did this on purpose, but having the one black character be like, hey, there's a problem, and all of the white characters be like, whatever. It's just kind of like, I wonder if they did that on purpose. But as Rhaenyra's kind of coming up to everybody, her dad's like, yo, you smell like a dragon. So I was like, oh, I wonder what a dragon smells like. But clearly she needs to take a bath, like her mother said. The council then brings up Viserys' brother, I can't get his name, Viserys' brother, Lord Daemon. He has apparently retrained, and they've funded the City Watch, which is kind of like the local guards. They're like, well, how come he never comes to the meetings? Like, he has a seat. And his brother, Viserys the king, is like, do you think he's distracted? And he's like, well, no, but the other guy. And he's like, well, then trust in my brother, trust in the process, like, let him do his thing. Again, Corlys brings up the Triarchy, being like, hey, this is going to be a problem. Like, if they end up closing the ports that we use, like, this could be a serious issue. And they're like, whatever, we'll deal with it when we deal with it. And he gets shut down. So the next order of business is that there's this heirs tournament. The king is expecting a baby. He wants to kind of show off for it. Some of the members are worried because they're like, hey, the baby isn't born yet and you don't know if it's actually a son. So like us throwing this big festival is kind of a big thing. Maybe we should cancel it. And as this is happening, Rhaenyra is coming around. She's pouring wine for everyone. And when she comes over to Corlys, he covers his hand over his cup. Like, no, I don't want any. And it's a small thing, but it was very much like, cool, is he doing this out of spite because she is the, daughter of the king? Does he not drink? Is he, what is the reasoning behind this small moment? It's not 100% clear, but clearly he's not happy with how this meeting is going. So he's being a little more defiant, as you can see. But as we talk about the tournament, Viserys is like, no, I'm super confident it's a boy. Like, don't worry, we're having this tournament. We move on to Rhaenyra and the guard from earlier who was glad she survived the dragon. Again, I don't know his name. It didn't pop up. I didn't hear anyone say it. So I'm just going to keep calling him the guard. So they head into the Iron Throne. Turns out Daemon, her uncle, is already sitting on the throne. And the guard is like, what the fuck is this guy doing? And Rhaenyra's like, yo, chill out. Let me go talk to him. So they start talking in a different language. I forget what it's called. And again, I don't think the show brought it up. So again, this show treats it like you've kind of already watched Game of Thrones in a way where there are certain things where I'm like, this isn't explained if it's my first time here, which could be a little confusing. But for the most part, they're just talking in a different language. That's all that we really need to know, especially because there's different subtitles. So she's like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm just sitting here." And she's like, "You sitting on the throne could be considered treason." And she brings up the fact that you haven't been showing up to meetings. And he's like, "Well, they're boring." And he's like, "I heard my brother is throwing me a tournament." And she's like, "No, it's for, the son." And he's like, "Well, the son isn't born yet, and technically I'm next for the throne, so it should be for me." And she's like, "Well, then I hope that I actually do have a brother and that he's the heir instead." And he's like, he clearly knows that she's like messing with him. He's like, "Oh, I bought you something." And it turns out to be a necklace made of a Valerian steel. He's like, "Let me put it on you." She turns around and he starts to put it on. And it's very, not very, but it's like sensual enough to be awkward. Again, Damon looks like a full grown man. Rhaenyra is a teenager, so it's very much like, ugh, can we not? But luckily, we don't linger on that too long. We actually go with Rhaenyra and Alicent, and they are sitting underneath a tree. They are going over Rhaenyra's studies about some sort of story that she's supposed to know, and Alicent realizes like she's not really locked in, and she's like, "You're very disagreeable when you're worried. Like I know you're worried. You think that your baby brother will overshadow you because he's going to be the heir." And she's like, "No, I only worry about my mom." And she's like, "My father can have his son. He's always wanted a son anyways." She's like, "I just want to travel around with you on my dragon and we can go eat cake." And she's like, "You're not worried about your position?" And she's like, "No, I like where I am. Like everything's cool here." And Alicent gets up and she begins to walk away all frustrated because clearly she knows her friend, and she's like, "I know that you're lying and this is bothering you." And before she can get too far, Rhaenyra spits out the story that she was supposed to already know. Alicent is taken back. Rhaenyra goes up and rips that page out of the book, and she's like, "Oh, in case you need to remember it for later." And she's like, "Well, what if we get in trouble?" She's like, "Ah, fuck it." And so that's the kind of end of that scene. But the more they spend time together, the more it was unclear of like, again, are they just friends or are they like a little more than friends? I'm not really sure. The vibes are kind of like in either camp. So I'm like, I don't know what this show's trying to tell me. But we go back to Viserys, and it turns out he has a wound on his back. They have no idea what it is. They're going to send out some messengers, see if they can figure it out. He's like, "I think it's just a cut from the Iron Throne." If you've never seen Game of Thrones, the Iron Throne is just a bunch of swords that have been like melted together to make a throne. So really not too practical. And the Maester, who is kind of like the head doctor, he thinks it's stress. The hand, who is the king's right hand, wants, keep this under wraps. You can't really have everyone know that the king is wounded. They're like, maybe we should cauterize the wound. And the king's like, "All right, fine. Like, whatever, gets this over with." So the king goes to see his wife. He's like, "You spend more time in the bath than you do on the throne, or than I do on the throne." And she's like, "This is the only place where I find peace lately. So this is where I've been." And she's like, "The pregnancy has been rough." She's like, "Honestly," and this is a joke, but she's like, "I wouldn't be surprised if a dragon came out of me." And she's like, "Our daughter really thinks that they'll be a girl and not a boy." They bring up Damon for some reason. Because I think she's just like, "Hey, how's your brother been?" He's like, "Yeah, I really haven't heard from him since I put him in charge of like the city watch. Maybe he'll show up for the tournament. That seems like something he'll naturally do." And even the wife is like, "Listen, I'm worried about celebrating early. We really don't know if it's a boy." And he's like, "No, listen, I had a dream." And he goes into like this deep detail, a bunch of like imagery and stuff of having a boy. He's like, "This is a boy." And she's like, "Listen, this has to be the last time for me. I can't keep having kids. I lost a baby in the cradle. I had 2 stillbirths, and I had 2 empty pregnancies. I'm sorry. I know my job essentially is to give you your heir, and I can't do that for you. If this one doesn't make it," she's like, "I can't mourn any more babies." So it's really unclear like what would happen if the baby came out, right, and let's say it was a girl or something. Like, would he just have to remarry, or like how does that work? I don't think that's clear, but I do like that she's like, "Listen, I can't keep doing this." You know what I mean? Like, I can't pretend I won't be here any longer if I keep pretending that everything's gonna be fine. So good on her for sticking to her boundaries and being like, this is it. This is the one and done. We go to Damon. He is with his city watch. He gives them a rousing speech. He's like, "Listen, everything's like, you guys we're unorganized. I brought you guys together. We're now stronger together. People are doing whatever they want. We need to put some order back into the city, and people are going to fear the color gold. And they go out and they just start beating people, and they're like cutting people's hands off and like cutting off their limbs and stuff like that. And it's really unclear in this moment of like what people have actually done. And even there's one guy that just like points and he's like, oh, like you're a murderer and you're a thief. And they start like beating those people and cutting those people up. And it was like, okay, are these actually criminals, or like are y'all just like out here to be like, we have the power, we're just gonna mess with some poor people? It's unclear. But before, like, it doesn't last too long until we get to the hand, who again is the king's right hand. He's talking to the king about Damon Dunn. Like, we immediately, like, things are popping off, and then it immediately switches to him telling like, hey, this is exactly what happened like 2 seconds ago. And he's like, we gotta put your brother in check. And as they walk through the door, Damon is actually at the meeting for once. And he's like, the city watch isn't your, personal army to do whatever. It's a power of the crown. And he's like, yeah, and the watch enforces the crown's rules. So, like, obviously I gotta do what I gotta do. And he's like, we need the city to be safe. We have this tournament coming up. So, I did what I had to do. And the king agrees. And of course the hand is like, dude, like what the, like I know he's your brother, but he doesn't say that. It's more in his face. Porlis also backs up Damon. He's like, yeah, we actually do need like a strong guard. So I'm kind of with him. The hand, who I guess feels slighted in somehow, or just like straight up doesn't like Damon, brings up the fact that he hasn't seen his wife. He's like, you spending all this time over here, or you're supposed to spend time with your wife? And he's like, my wife is happier with me gone. And he's like, honestly, in that city, I forget which one it is. I think it's the Vale. But he's like, honestly, over there, he's like, the sheep are prettier than the women. He's like, I really don't want to be over there. And the hand's like, yo, you made a promise to your wife. Like, you're married, you made your vows. Like, you should be over there with your wife. And he's like, listen, if you want my wife so bad, then why don't you just have her? In fact, he's like, didn't you just lose your wife recently? And that pisses him off, and the hand stands up. He's ready for action, but he calms himself down and he sits back down. The king's like, listen, if you do anything like that again where you send the boys out and you guys just start wreaking havoc, you will have to be answered for. I think Damon leaves, and then he brings up the fact, this is the king, that King's Landing has kind of been shit since his grandmother died, and maybe this new city watch will actually end up being a good thing. So we cut over to Damon. Actually, we cut over to some people peeping, because we are now in a brothel, and they are watching Damon, and he is banging one of the girls, and he can't finish, and he goes, and he's just like, goes to the window, and he's kind of just like upset at himself. And she's like, listen, maybe I can bring someone else over, like maybe you want to, dance with somebody else. And it doesn't seem like he's like in the mood for it. And she's like, listen, you're all of these great things. He has a bunch of different names. She's like, you're like all of these things. The king can't replace you with his new son. Like, don't stress about it. So clearly it's like not performance anxiety, but like, he's not in the right headspace to get the job done. So it is time for the tournament. The queen is in labor at this time. The jousting begins. Jousting looks way more violent in Game of Thrones than like I feel like in other things I've seen previous. So it's like, oh, I wouldn't want to actually be jousting. But as this is happening, random jousting is happening. Rhaenyra and Alicent are just straight up gossiping between each other. Damon ends up getting on the field. He has to pick his opponent. He picks a Hightower. That's the same family as the Hand. The guy was like bothering him about his wife. And again, real quick, as I say this, I don't think at this point they've said, or I think when they were arguing, they said the Hand's name for the first time, which is Otto Hightower. But if you didn't catch that, then you'd probably be like, I don't understand why Damon picking this guy even matters. So it was one of those things of like, again, the show almost acts like you've already been here before and doesn't really hold your hand in the sense of like if you're a new viewer. So I'd be curious to see if someone who's never watched Game of Thrones watched this and like actually picked up on all the subtle things that are happening. But I don't know. I haven't asked anyone. We go back to the story. So Damon is jousting with this high tower guy. When their second go around, he ends up like bending over and like hitting the horse instead of hitting the guy, which takes out the horse and gives him the win. He rides over to Alicent, who is the Hand's daughter, who is also a high tower, and he's like, "Oh, can I have your favor?" And that's where they like give you a flower and kind of like a blessing. And the guy's clearly like he's doing this on purpose. Like he keeps picking my family. And as this is happening, someone comes over and they whisper to the Hand, and the Hand whispers to the king, and the king gets up and leaves. We are immediately hit by the queen screaming. She is in pain. There are complications with the baby. King talks to the doctor. So he's like, can you do something for her? And he's like, listen, we gave her all the milk of the poppy we could without, damaging the baby. Like, it's kind of up to her now. And then we go back to the tournament. And at this point, the knights are fighting off, like they'll joust and then they'll get off the horse and they're just straight up fighting to the death at this point. And Corlys is there and he's like, is this really how we're supposed to honor the new baby coming into the world? And his wife is like, listen, we've been in peace for like 70 years. She's like, none of these guys know battle. And also, like, they're young, probably aren't banging people. You're putting a sword in their hand. They got a lot of energy to get out in the short. She's like, that's why all these fights keep popping off. But we go back to the queen. She looks passed out. She looks like she's on death's door for real. And the maester's like, yo, we gotta talk. He pulls the king aside and he's like, listen, there comes a time where a father must make a choice. And he's like, either we save your wife or we save the baby. And unfortunately, this guy wants an heir so much that he's like, I'm gonna save the baby. Which is like, yo, that's crazy, man. Couldn't be me. I'd save my wife. But that's just me. We cut back to the tournament. Daemon is going against this guy, Cole. They brought him up before, but it was nothing to really write down in terms of notes. So that's kind of just popping off real quick. And we go back and they're going to bring the baby out. And that's what they're going to bring the baby out. And he's like, oh, I love you. And she's like, what's happening? And they like pull her body close, bring out a knife. And this part was like heartbreaking because she's scared out of her mind. She knows what's going to happen. They're going to cut the baby out of her. She's begging her husband, please don't do this. Please don't do this. And he's just letting it happen. And he's just holding her hand. He has his head down like, oh, he can't even look at her as they just cut her open and start getting the baby out. And it's like, dude, I don't know how you can love someone and just like be okay with that. But the fact that like you're so determined to have an heir that you let that happen to, this person that you loved is just like, I don't know, it's wild to me. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's just the way I love, but I couldn't do it. But we go back to the knights and Cole is fighting Daemon. Cole knocks Daemon down from the horse, but they continue to fight on foot. Daemon got a sword. Cole has like a not a ball and chain. I forgot what the thing's called. But anyways, they're fighting. Daemon has the upper hand at first, and it's cutting back and forth between this fight and the pregnancy. So Daemon gets the upper hand, and then we see them still cutting the baby out. Daemon knocks down Cole. We see them pull the baby out. The baby starts crying. It's like, okay, yay, it's a boy. Cole then gets the upper hand, and he's about to like hit Daemon in the face and everything, and he's like, yield. And Daemon just smiles like, go ahead and do it, man. I don't care. And Cole decides not to do it anyways. And we hear Viserys crying over his wife. We go back to Cole. He asks for Rhaenyra's favor, which she gives it to him. We go back to the baby, and it's like, congratulations, it's a boy, yeah. And then the baby gets quiet, and you can see the doctor or the maester look down, and it's not a happy face. And then we go back to the tournament, and slowly people in like the box seats, I guess you would say, are like whispering to each other and like getting up, and everyone has like shock on their face. So clearly something isn't good. We cut to this nice looking cliffside. Turns out that neither the baby or Viserys' wife made it. Rhaenyra is standing next to Daemon. He's like, hey, they're waiting for you. And she's like, I wonder if my father finally found happiness in the moments that my brother were alive, for however long it was. And he's like, listen, your father needs you right now more than ever. Like, you got to get over there. And she's like, I'll never be a son. She walks over. She goes to tell her dragon to set her mom and her brother on fire. And she chokes up. She looks over her father, and that man is like leagues away in his mind. and she says Dracarys, and the dragon comes down and burns the bodies. King then has a meeting. Quickly into the meeting, his council members are like, we need to pick a new heir now that, your kid didn't make it. And they obviously bring up Daemon. They bring up Daemon, and they're not about it, really. And, they're like, look at what he did with the watch and how he went out and just, like, beat people and cut them up. And the king's like, you gave him that position. And he's like, he's my brother. He's blood. He deserves to be on a council. And they're like, yes, he does deserve to be on a council, but we don't want him as king. They're like, what if something bad happens? What if by design? And he's like, are you suggesting that my brother would kill me? It kind of gets quiet. No one wants to really speak up. And they're just like, listen, we just think that he's bad for the throne. We think that you should name someone else as your heir. And they bring up Rhaenyra. They're like, we don't want Daemon as king, all right? So he's like, you want me to choose between my brother and my daughter? And this is where Corlys speaks up. And he's like, there are other options. And someone's like, you want to pick your wife? And he's like, well, my wife was the runner-up before Viserys got the king. Like, why couldn't I throw her in the ring? And the king is obviously pissed. He's like, my wife and my son just died. I'm not going to be here sitting with you guys talking about, who's coming next and watching you guys worry about all this stuff when, like, my shit's going on, all right? I'm done. And he gets up and he leaves, rightfully so, because it's like, I haven't even fully grieved and you guys are already worried about, like, what happens next. Like, give me a fucking day. Jesus Christ. But we cut to the hand, and he is sending out a message. He called for his daughter to come see him. And he's like, oh, and she's crying, obviously, because her friend is going through it. And he's like, how's Rhaenyra? And she's like, well, she lost her mom. And he's like, I've been thinking about your mom lately and how, she's gone too. He's like, she asked how the king is. And he's like, I think you should go and pay him a visit, give him a little company. And she's like, oh, what, like, you want me to go hang out with the king? He's like, yeah, he'll be glad to have a visitor. Why don't you put on one of your mother's dresses? And it's like, bro, you're sending your daughter to go court, your teenage daughter, to go kind of like be the king's rebound for real. And also, like, this man just lost his family like yesterday. What are we doing here? But I mean, that's the Game of Thrones, baby. I don't like it, but that's just how they play it, you know what I mean? I'm not part of the story, I'm just talking. But yeah, so he sends off his daughter to go do that. So the king is working on this, like, diorama of the entire city. It's kind of dope for real. And he's like kissing his wife's ring in private, and that's when Allison shows up with the book, and she's like, I thought I could just like hang out with you and like just read you a story and keep you company. And she's like, when my mother died, all I wanted was just one person to say I'm sorry for your loss. And she was like, I'm really sorry for your loss, your grace. And the two of them just kind of hang out. We cut to Daemon. He's back in the brothel. He's zoned out. Obviously, he found out that he's not going to be the heir anymore. The woman that he was banging earlier comes over, and she's like, how good does it feel to be the only heir once again, unknowingly, like, rubbing it in. And she's like, yeah, everyone, we should drink to his celebration. And one of his homies is like, silence, the king needs to give a speech. And Daemon smiles and puts on a face, but you can tell, like, it's definitely a front, at least in my opinion, because I'm like, he knows that he's not the heir. He overheard them saying, like, yo, we don't want him. So as it looks like he's about to give a speech, we actually go to the hand again, and he's snitching. And he's like, yo, I heard Daemon went to his brothel with his boys, and they were talking, and he called your dead son the heir for a day. And that didn't sit right. So it cuts immediately to Daemon walking into the throne room, seeing his brother on the throne. He's like, you can cut it out with the tough guy act. Like, I know you, dude. And he's like, you're going to call me your grace, or I'm going to have the guards cut out your tongue. And he's like, did you say it? And he's like looking at him weird. And he's like, did you call my son the heir for a day? And Damon's like, listen, man, we all grieve in our own ways. You know what I mean? Like, hey, this ain't that deep. And he's like, my family's destroyed. And instead of being here to celebrate, instead of being here for us, you went to go celebrate in a brothel. And he's like, I'm the only one who sticks up for you here. All the council members don't like you. you throw everything I do for you in my face. He's like, well, you always send me away. It's been 10 years and you never asked me to be your right hand man. And he's like, well, why would I do that? And he's like, because I'm your brother. What are you talking about? And they start to argue over Hightower, and Damon's like, listen, that guy doesn't like you. He's not going to protect you. And he's like, protect me from what? He's like, from yourself. He's like, you're weak, dude. Your council is using you to get their own ends. Like, you can't even see it. Viserys is like, listen, I'm naming a new heir. And Damon's like, I am your heir. And he's like, no, I want you to return to your wife. That's an order. And as he says that, his guards like turn around to face Damon. And he's like, you're done. Like, get out of here. And so Damon leaves. And the scene kind of ends with Viserys leaning back in the throne. And he cuts himself on the finger. So clearly this throne is slowly taking this man out. Foreshadowing for sure. So we go to Viserys. He's down in some sort of like basement area with a bunch of candles, and he's like waving his hands over the candles like way too close. And there's this big dragon skull hanging above him. And Rhaenyra goes to see him. He's like, when you look at dragons, what do you see? And she's like, why am I down here? She's like, you haven't talked to me since Mom's funeral. And he's like, just answer me. Like, it's important, please. What do you see when you see dragons? And she's like, I see us. And he's like, okay, like, speak more on that. And she's like, well, everyone thinks we're like these gods, you know what I mean? But it's only because we have dragons. She's like, honestly, without dragons, we're regular people just like everyone else. And he's like, exactly. The dragons are just an illusion. They're a power that we should have never trifled with. But a Targaryen needs to be on the throne, whether it is a king or a queen. And he kind of looks at her and he's like, listen, I focused way too much time on trying to make an heir that I've kind of ignored you. Then this is where, again, we kind of do that shift back and forth between different scenes of Rhaenyra getting sworn in. You get all the people like bending the knee and being like, yes, I will, I recognize you as the heir. We get Viserys talking to her again down in that basement area. And he's like, this is no simple gesture. The throne is the most dangerous seat there is to have. So, like, if I'm going to call you heir, I need you to understand, like, shit's going to pop off at some point. We see Daemon as this, like, the swearing in is happening and these conversations are happening, like, all at the same time. Daemon goes to his dragon. The woman from the brothel shows up and he's like, no, come close. Like, don't be scared. And he puts puts her hand on his dragon. We go back to the basement again, and Viserys is like, hey, there's one final thing. There's a story of Aegon and, everything he's seen. And there's this great winter that's going to come. And when it does, like, everything is going to essentially, like, start, like, the apocalypse. And, there's the Song of Ice and Fire. And basically, he's like, we need a Targaryen on the Iron Throne for when shit pops off so they can lead everyone and, like, save the world. So he's like, I need you to promise me, like, if that time comes, that you will be on the throne really ready to, like, save the world. And as this happens, we see Daemon fly away with that woman. So it's like, okay, this isn't just like a little fling. He, like, clearly has feelings for her. But he's also supposed to fly back to see his wife. So it's like, what are you planning on doing with you're going to pretend like she's like your servant or something? Or I don't know. But it ends with Rhaenyra, like, fully being sworn in. She kind of, like, looks off like, damn, this is real. And then the episode ends. And that was the first episode of House of the Dragon. So if it is your first time here, I have a 3-point rating scale. It is one and done, give it a chance, and I'm in. For this one, I would give it an... This one's a little tricky. I think I would give it an I'm in. Because give it a chance is like, I definitely watch another episode just based on this first one. I think, the Game of Thrones is, and I mean, like, the game itself of, like, everyone has their own little plots going on, you got Hightower trying to, like, give his daughter to the king. You got the king who's trying to, like, be a good man, but he just lost his people, and people are trying to take advantage of him, and he's getting cut up by the throne. You have the brother who now is like, who knows what that guy's gonna do? He just took his little courtesan to go see his wife, so it's like, huh? And obviously, the beginning of the episode set up the fact that, like, people don't want a woman in charge, which is why Viserys ended up being in charge in the first place. So I imagine, you know, Viserys being like, yeah, my teenage daughter is going to be my heir. That's going to ruffle a lot of feathers. So all of that is enough for me to be like, yeah, I got to watch this next episode and see where it goes. And of course, as I said in the beginning, in case you forgot, I am still watching this show. I am on season 2. I think as of recording this, there's only, well, I guess another episode might come out tonight, so maybe there's 6 episodes, but there's only 5. What I will say, no spoilers about this season, current season, season 2. I was a little worried at first because the first 2 episodes weren't hitting. And I was like, do I even like this show anymore? And then episode 3 is kind of like, all right. And episode 4 popped off. So I'm glad that so far the show is able to continue the trajectory of what Game of Thrones kind of did. Of like, all right, we're building. And like maybe every episode isn't like a hitter, but you will have the hitters of like whether it is action or it is like, again, the plots that are going on that really keep things interesting. And hopefully, I don't know how long this show is going to go for. Again, they have like 172 years to play with. But I'm hoping that this one has a more concise like idea of where the story is going, and that they don't just full on fuck up the last season for the memes. So yeah, again, I'm going to give this first episode an I'm in, and I'm still watching the second season, so we'll see how the show goes. But that is where I'm going to leave this episode. If you like it, feel free to give it some sort of rating. Again, I am slowly putting all of my episodes up on YouTube, on my YouTube channel. It's the same name, We Don't Know TV. I don't know when this episode is going to go up, but eventually you can find it there. If you want to keep up with me, you can follow me on Twitter at Little Leafers. And yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Peace.